Back in the age of dinosaurs, many manufacturers had their own approach for connectivity and synchronization. MIDI allowed users and abusers like myself to integrate MIDI equipped devices from any manufacturer to work together, and also brought computer sequencing to the masses. And yes, before the digital audio workstation, MIDI sequencing allowed musicians to perform and play back multiple instruments and use them for recording for performances. This was the beginning of the home studio era. Way long ago. MIDI started off with a 5-pin DIN cable as a common connector. The interesting thing is that only 2 of the 5 pins are typically used. A few devices back in the day received power over MIDI on 2 of the remaining pins. From that MIDI connection, 16 separate MIDI channels are utilized, so each device could respond only to the messages on its assigned MIDI channel. In Eurorack, we can use a wide variety of MIDI to CV controllers, from the straightforward 2 HP MIDI module to the more sophisticated units like the Bassel Instruments 1983 MIDI to CV module. Now in my system, I use the Expert Sleepers FH2 and 2 additional expanders. The FH2 is extremely flexible and can accept most any type of MIDI message and convert it into a CV signal. MIDI in Eurorack is converted into voltages used by the various modules. A single key on the keyboard sends MIDI note on via your MIDI to CV module, and it's converted into a gate signal, while the MIDI note is converted to the 1 volt per octave pitch standard. Additional associated messages can also be converted to these control voltages, including MIDI velocity, aftertouch, and of course, modulation and pitch wheels. Each of these messages can generate its own voltage output. Releasing the key sends 3 more messages, including channel, note, and release velocity. Other MIDI messages include controller information, where the most common ones are the modulation and pitch wheels on your MIDI keyboard, both of which transmit MIDI continuous controller or MIDI CC messages, of which there are 128 different ones. A couple of the more standard messages are, for example, volume control, that's CC7, modulation wheels assigned to CC1. Now some of these controls are predefined, while others are up for grabs for whatever needs you may have. MIDI also, of course, has timing capabilities by means of either MIDI clock or MIDI time code. MIDI clock includes tempo, start and stop commands, and tracks in beats and measures, while MIDI time code tracks hours, minutes, seconds, and frames, and can be easily translated to simply time code. In addition to notes and timing, we're also sending MIDI continuous controller information. Here's a couple of cool usages that I like. Okay, each of these 5 knobs on my LPD-8 is mapped to the outputs of the FH2. Now those are going into plats, and the first knob controls the model. Second knob controls timbre. Third knob controls frequency modulation level, which basically is adding to it, which is changing the pitch. Number 4 controls the morph, which is basically selecting the different waves in the wavetable. And number 5 controls the harmonic. So these are just a couple of ways that you can use MIDI to add additional functionality to your Eurorack system. I do need to mention that after almost 40 years, MIDI is finally being updated to provide additional functionality and stability to the aging protocol. MIDI 2.0 boasts high-resolution 32-bit control and implementation up to 120-bit resolution, improved timing, and bidirectional communication, which allows things like automatic configuration between devices for mapping controls, and much more. MIDI 2.0 will be backwards compatible with MIDI 1.0 devices. So if you're interested in MIDI to CV converters, keep an eye out for MIDI 2.0 modules in the very near future. In the article, I mentioned that I was caught off guard when I installed my new Mac Studio computer, only to find out that both of my MIDI interfaces would not work as the drivers had yet to be updated. So this sent me on a mission to find out which MIDI interfaces did work. I did find out my iConnectivity audio interface still worked, and it has MIDI in and out, and all of the iConnectivity MIDI I/O devices are working fine under the new hardware. But during this MIDI interface safari, I found a very interesting product from ESI, the ESI M4UEX, which is such a beautiful name. I may name my next child after it. But it's not only compatible with the Mac M1 chip and Monterey OS on the Mac, but it is also using newer technology. First of all, it has USB 3 connectivity, which is a welcome addition, and the unique port allocation is just mind-blowing. The M4UEX has 8 ports, 4 in the front, 4 on the back, and they can be configured any way. Either port can be MIDI in or MIDI out, and on top of that, the interface figures it all out automatically. The manufacturer says that it's possible to upgrade this to MIDI 2.0 when the time comes, although there's not a current project in-house. The M4UEX has a built-in 3-port USB 3 hub and boasts the lowest MIDI latency and jitter of any MIDI device. So this is my new MIDI interface. Thanks for listening, and I am still Reek Havok.